Hi folks, welcome to a thrilling new episode. Hi folks, welcome to a thrilling new episode of the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast. I'm very excited to introduce our very first guest, V. Schmidt. She brings a unique perspective as both a patient and a cybersecurity expert in medical devices. Her personal experiences and expertise offer invaluable insights into the complex intersection of healthcare and cybersecurity, making her story both informative and impactful. Here it goes. Veronica, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me. I'm super excited to be here.
Wonderful. Well, thank you for being the first guest. It's super exciting to have you on. I chose you because I thought that you had such an inspirational voice across medical device cybersecurity, and I wanted to hear more about your perspectives and especially answer the question of why medical devices need to be secured ultimately. So yeah, maybe we should get to know you a little bit better, V. So V, can you tell us a bit more about yourself and how you got into medical devices and cybersecurity?
So it's actually an interesting story. So one can say that it's very near and dear to my heart. It's literally the thing that keeps me upright and going every day. So at the age of 19, I suffered fainting spells and I wasn't healthy, and I was just a danger to myself effectively. Like I would be walking and just faint and not know why. And they diagnosed me with various dysrhythms. So my heart would go out of rhythm, and then that would cause a fainting spell, and it would stop periodically. So what happened was I needed a medical device. Now, in South Africa, where I'm from, you have medical insurance a lot like in the United States. So not at all like where I live now in Norway, where we have national health care. So I got told that we had to pay for the device. Now, my family comes from a very lower class family. We don't have a lot of money, especially not this kind of money to pay for a device that I need to live. And kind of spoke to my doctor, saw a psychologist, and decided to go home at the age of 19, where ultimately things would progress and get worse and it would end. But before I could leave the hospital, my cardiologist stopped me and said, listen, the manufacturers actually donated your device. And that was Medtronic. And that is a company that I now consult and research for. And the reason that I became obsessed with it was because I had a device and I've always been a hacker. My dad will tell you I got into trouble since the age of 14 because I twiddled and fiddled with everything that I could. And I just became, interested in, can someone potentially compromise my heart? But I come from a background in digital forensics, right? I know hackers will get in. I know cyber criminals, we can only stop them that much. But I am obsessed with actually finding out and detecting that this has happened. And that's kind of what started me down the route of medical device forensics.
Mm-hmm.
So that's a little bit about me.
Oh, wonderful. I mean, it's a really cool path. It's very personal and a great story. I wondered when you think about your device and you consider the possibility of it being hackable, how does it feel to know that it's a possibility?
So that's an interesting question. So my perspective has shifted. So if you go Google me, you'll see there's a lot of angry patient, presentations out there. And I found the Biohack Village through DEF CON, which was amazing because it found a home of other patients and other people and manufacturers. And I actually started to learn more about it. Now, when I made the decision to get the device, whether it's hackable or not really didn't feature because I was making a decision between life and death. Right? I wasn't making a decision based upon should I have an iPhone or an Android. It's not the same thing. This device is a device that keeps me upright. It's a device that takes over beating when my heart decides that it cannot do it itself. It really is a life-sustaining device. I've also had it where the device wasn't functioning fully and wasn't set up right for me, and my quality of life died. And there's nothing worse than being in your 20s and being unable to walk 100 meters in your own house, knowing that there's nothing wrong with your brain, there's nothing wrong with anything else in your body, but you don't have the physical strength. But I've
Yeah.
also learned that these devices are actually built for the purpose of keeping us alive. Right? It's not built to be a UB key or a secure algorithm. That is not the functionality of it. So how does it feel? It doesn't really feature for me anymore, right? Because I have seen the good, the bad, and the ugly when this device doesn't give me my quality of life. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't work on this, right? And that's kind of where my excitement comes in because my whole PhD is around this topic. Like, it's how to do robust logging within medical devices. Um, that is kind of my whole core belief is that, yes, whilst we can't prevent everything, we should be detecting it, meaning we should have better logs on these devices.
Yeah, better logs and better security in general. V, maybe you could clarify for us. A lot of people a few years ago would have said, who would hack a healthcare institution? And then we've had the past 4 or 5 years. Do you think that people will eventually massively try to attack? Who could that person be attacking medical devices? Is this something you fear?
So, that's kind of the same question that prior to COVID, I would have had a different answer, right? A large portion of my time during COVID was spent helping hospitals stay afloat in South Africa. Like, we had volunteers that kept fighting the good battle, and everyone would say, who would want to hack a hospital in the middle of the pandemic? Well, there are criminals that really don't care. And it's like I said to someone, if I can stab someone, I can hack their medical device. The difference here is there is difficulties in some of these devices and their proximity attacks, and it's a little bit more complicated than a lot of the mainstream media makes us believe, specifically when it comes to implants. But there's a core thing we need to remember that the same people committing violent crimes are going to be the same people that ultimately compromise the device. But it also might be accidental. It might be someone that's not knowing what they're doing. Now, the thing here is it's really not that easy in real life. It's easy in a lab. It's easy in a controlled environment. It's a little harder when you put devices in people's bodies. Right? There's complexities that go along with that. So I think we will see it at some point. But I'm also positive that in the last 5 years, I know that manufacturers have been taking more steps. But the interesting thing about medical devices, right, is if you think of an island, imagine this island. It's barren, there's nothing on, and I come to you and say, hey, can you build me the following mansion, right? And it's fine. At the moment, you can build that mansion. 3 years later, I come to you and say, hey, you need to update this. It needs to be bigger, better, and more secure, right? And then 5 years down the line, we do the same thing. At some point, my island becomes too small for everything that I want to do. But my island is still a good island. So consider an implant, an ICD, a pacemaker. They last 15 years, right? Easily now. Now, if I wanted to change that battery or change the security and the hardware, I have to take it out of my body. I have to have surgery, right? So it's not just that easy to say, we can just update, we can roll new hardware. The software can only grow as far as the hardware allows it to grow. So at some point, that device will be vulnerable. In its 15 years, in its 8 years, or in the 20 years it exists, the reality is it will become vulnerable.
So it's a side effect of progress in the end, right? As more IT electronic capabilities grow, devices will inevitably get more vulnerable because hardware can only sustain so much capabilities.
Definitely. And I think the interesting thing here is, right, we want to be more interconnected. I remember back when COVID hit, I was in London when COVID started and we were all rushing to get back home. And then I got sick. Then I had symptoms and we thought, okay, COVID. And you get treated very differently. And The doctor's like, you can't come in. We'll ship all the telemetry to you. You were seeing him over video. That's how the check-ins happened. Ended up, I didn't have COVID. I had H1N1. So I'm a little bit behind on the viral pandemics.
All
But
right.
I was monitored through telemetry, right? Even my implant was monitored through telemetry. Now, considering if we didn't have that, what would I have had to do? I would have been stuck at home without any assistance, which for someone with comorbidities is very dangerous, right? Because we weren't going into hospitals. They didn't want to see us. We didn't want to see them. Everything was done remotely. So yeah, technology is scary, but technology is saving lives. If this technology didn't exist when I was 19 and I'm 38 now, I would not be sitting here talking to you. That's the simple nature of this. Whilst technology opens so many threads, it also opens extra heartbeats, extra memories. The fact that I have two little girls, which I wouldn't have had without it, right? It doesn't feature for me that this is something that's dangerous, because this is something that's given me many extra years that I was not meant to have.
It's super interesting what you're saying, because for most of what I see from cybersecurity experts, we're more pulling the alarm saying things aren't working out. And you seem to be doing the opposite, saying we're making great strides. It's great. And you seem to say that cybersecurity has gotten a lot better. So would you say that we need to keep going? What would you say we are compared to the risk of getting attacked compared to the level of defenses we have? Are we in the right line? Do we need more?
So let's look at where we were 5 years ago. I've been doing this for a long while. And the biohack village, if you look quite recently again, had many manufacturers come and bring their devices and say to attackers, attack me and tell me where I'm vulnerable. 5 years ago, we'd be hitting with legal battles, right? We'd be hushed. We wouldn't be working with manufacturers. Ask me, been there, done that, got the t-shirt. So 5 years ago, it was a different conversation. Now manufacturers are actually actively seeking out, in bug bounties and attacks to identify vulnerabilities, right? That we didn't have. So whilst we aren't moving to the pace of traditional cybersecurity, and this is my pet peeve with cybersecurity professionals that are signaling alarms, they're not the ones working for Biohack Village. They're not the ones that are working with the FDA. They're not the ones that are actually working with the manufacturers. Those of us that have had our hands dirty, that have bought medical devices, attacked it, compromised it, and worked with a manufacturer, has seen progress. Slow progress, but it's an industry that moves slow because of regulations. Now, 5 years ago, the FDA had no guidance in terms of cybersecurity. Recently, we now have very robust guidelines that's enforceable, mentioning things like forensic capabilities, forensic data logging, event logging, and event detection, right? Things that now manufacturers are held to account. So when I say to you 5 years ago, the conversations I was having versus the conversations I'm having now, they are night and day. Does that mean healthcare will not be a target? Healthcare will always be a target. It's a critical infrastructure, and it's something that it's high impact, high stakes. So we will see that. But we are making progress and getting better, because now we can have a security conversation. It's no longer, you're a hacker, you're bad, don't want you near me, you're the enemy. We're working with manufacturers, and I can tell you things like at Biohacking Village, you had the likes of Medtronic, Draeger, like big names bringing their devices. There was a surgical robotics device there last year that was attacked, and they were working with the manufacturer. So when I say to you that there has been positive change, it's just not the positive change that we might want to see in the media, right? Because we're doing the work, but we're not necessarily publicly disclosing these things because there's patient lives at stake.
Yeah, it's always tricky with cybersecurity. Like, can you disclose? Should you? Or yeah, and usually, from your experience working with manufacturers, when you do research on the devices, is there a culture of sharing vulnerabilities? Are they taking them in and actually making the changes that they need to make?
It depends. Very different manufacturers are very different. What I have found is there's communities like HISAC where manufacturers and healthcare delivery organizations come together and they share a lot of information. Whilst this is not a public forum, this is a closed forum for manufacturers and healthcare delivery organizations. They are now having open conversations. I know of quite a few academic papers where we've submitted things and they've improved it. I know specifically from my experience and the research that I have done, some of it which will never see the light of day because it's sensitive in nature has been fixed, right? We didn't have the conversations of I disclose a vulnerability to you and you work with me to fix it. We had the conversation of you get called in for a meeting and in the corner is a silent party that's legal, that's doing their best to shut you down. That was the conversation 5 years ago. Now we're seeing a lot of the big manufacturers hiring people out of Biohack Village. So hackers that found vulnerabilities are getting jobs at manufacturers.
That makes sense. We've talked about security, the medical device, the FDA. Now I want to talk about who this is all about, especially is the patients. From a patient's point of view, from other people you talk to, have you seen that medical device patients are looking into security? Is this a concern that they're aware of?
So post-COVID, the interesting trend that we've seen is that people, for example, with diabetes and cardiac issues and even epilepsy, there has been more occurrences in younger people, right? And in younger people are more keen to ask questions and be more tech savvy, right? Traditionally, for you to get a pacemaker, you're normally 80 and your heart's busy failing. Right, but we are seeing a lot of younger people get those. I mean, I've even worked with some families where their kids had to get a pacemaker and they wanted to know how secure it was and how they explain it to the kid what they're getting. So in terms of that, we are certainly seeing our patient demographic get a little bit younger and want to know a little bit more. Right, and especially with kind of the mainstream media, which I really dislike, when they discuss hacking of medical devices, they will always put a pacemaker there. Even when the article has got nothing to do with a pacemaker, there has to be an image of a pacemaker. And that, it inflames people to say, oh no, this device, this is the device they're referring to, and it's not. The biggest concern for me is when a patient goes and talks to a cardiologist about this. Cardiologist has got no training in talking about cybersecurity with patients. They don't even know the cybersecurity of the devices, right? So, we're failing our doctors that give life-saving treatment because we don't train them in this, and they then can't address things to the patient. And I've experienced this both in Norway, because I live here now, and in South Africa. Initially, I thought it was a geographical thing. Come from a third world country, maybe we're a bit behind the times. But I actually found that my doctors in South Africa was more open to discuss cybersecurity versus in Norway, where I got shut down when I raised concerns about a device they wanted to give me versus the one that I had. And it was kind of the situation of don't be silly, it's fine. And that's not how to approach a patient. We're scared. We're making a big decision to put a foreign thing in our heart that literally is attached to us and monitors us 24/7, right? And takes over beating where it's needed. It is a bit of a mind melt when you consider this and you think that this is a computer, it's got wireless, it's got Bluetooth, it's got radio frequency, it logs things, it sends data away. It's intimidating for any patient, right? And anyone with a little bit of know-how on tech is going to go Google this and find every horror story out there, and no one's going to be able to put them at ease.
So your advice then is to take it a little bit more easy on cybersecurity. Like, understand that it's a risk, yes, but it's mostly managed as of now, right?
So I think my main messaging is when we are discussing cybersecurity on medical devices, we need to be very clear what kind of medical device we are talking about. Implants are a whole different ballgame versus a infusion pump or a patient monitor or an MRI machine. Like most MRI machines are mostly going to be Linux or potentially Windows, right? Those we know about cybersecurity. But when we start talking about embedded devices that we don't have an operating system, when we don't have a file system, and we're running on firmware, right, it's very different. But I think we have the single messaging like everything's crap, everything's bad. But it really isn't, because we are seeing encryption on medical devices. We are seeing updates being able to go. We are seeing logging, detection capabilities. We are seeing progress, but it's not the traditional cyber progress we want to see, right? We want to have a device that we can infinitely update and pull out the hardware if we want to do it. And that's not medical devices. There's a little bit of nuance to it. At some point, they become vulnerable. And I always say to hospitals, the biggest advice I can give you is segment and segment well, right? Because that is going to be the key to actually being successful in knowing what's going on. And also having detection capabilities. Because another thing, a hospital takes in 20 different kinds of devices from different manufacturers, all communicating differently, all having different operating systems and security measures. And then we put it on this hostile network and we tell it to function and we say a little prayer and hope everything's okay. It's difficult. It's not an easy fix. It's not an IT infrastructure we're building. You have to anticipate being vulnerable of a vulnerability you don't know about. And you can't open the device and fix the hardware or change the hardware because it's not your device. If you open it, now that's not a valid device anymore, and regulation says it needs to be disposed of. It's complicated. And I think working in it for 5 years, I appreciate the fact that it's complicated. But I'm going to take my small wins, because wins in a line of business that is very slow, I'm going to take my wins where I have better logging, or I have forensic capability, or I have encryption of data, or better monitoring, right? Because I'm never going to be able to solve it all.
Got it. Wow. So you have a medical device. You're gonna know in 10, 15 years there's gonna be vulnerabilities from there. If you have a medical device and you're gonna implant it, it's gonna be there in patients for 10, 15 years. What mechanisms do you put in place to make sure that it stays relevant within these 10, 15 years without necessarily going over the board with overthinking it?
So I think and I'm not an expert in risk assessment in terms that there's people that are way smarter than me. I'm a patient and I'm a security researcher, right? I don't make those big decisions. But for me as a patient, how I kind of work through it in my head, because I've had a device. Remember, I come from South Africa. Our devices are way older than the US and the EU gets. We're about 5, 6 years behind. So if you consider the previous device that I had vulnerabilities on, right? And I had to decide, am I getting the same device, just one that functions? Or do we pivot and go to something more secure, but clinically not so good, right? Because the old device, the only reason was, some of the vulnerabilities, which is not probable to be exploited. So the probability of exploitation was very low, right? And the risk as well was not really quantifiable. There was no evidence that it would cause me harm. So the discussion that I had with my cardiologist was, what outweighs, what's more important for me, right? Now, for me, it was clinical. I want to stay upright. I want to be able to be independent. As a patient, that's what's important to me. Right? As a cybersecurity professional, my other hat, I want to have a device near my heart that's near perfect. And then I started going into manufacturing and trying to write my own software and trying to run my own firmware. And I realized, like, I'm human. There is always going to be something. And if I don't know about it today, it's going to be tomorrow. But I think it's asking the question about patient risk. Is patient safety impacted? Now, there is many times where devices get recalled because there's a patient safety issue, right? But sometimes one needs to consider that your hardware can only take as much. And then the decision is always the patient's. If we recall, we can't force the patients to take things out. Like if there's a recall, there was a recall on leads that I had. Now, lead removal is complicated because those leads have been in your body for 10 years. They're attached into veins into your heart. So,
just for those of us who are not medical or don't have English as native language, veins are
leads. So these are the connectors that go from the device into my heart that senses the electric connectivities. So it grows and attaches with scar tissue to your heart. In my case, to the apex of my heart. Meaning that the risk of removal was great. Now, there was a problem with that the lead could break, right? That was why it was recalled. But we had to make the decision, do we just do it? My leads were fine. Do we monitor it and watch it, right, for when it is a problem? Or do we attempt this dangerous surgery, right? The doctors in South Africa said, we're leaving and monitoring it. You'll come in every 3 months, we'll check the impedance, we'll do the tests, and we'll make sure it's okay. Because that surgery is dangerous. Now, a year and a half down the line, the device moved and the line fractured. Then we made the decision to have the surgery. And things went wrong. I'm not going to lie to you, it wasn't a great surgery. It wasn't one I would recommend for you to do. It sucked. But I had to do it because I didn't have a reason. Am I glad I waited the year and a half? Yes. Right? Now, it's the same thing with security flaws. Just because there is a vulnerability doesn't mean a hacker is going to be able to remotely exploit it. Specifically implants. It's not that easy. Now, it's different when it is something that connects to a phone, but generally implants aren't programmable by a mobile phone, right? They're done in a controlled environment. So again, it's understanding there's complexities to it and understanding the patient perspective. I had a lady that had a device. There was a vulnerability that came out and the updates bricked the manufacturer's device. Not going to name names. If you Google it, you can find it. But I had someone reach out to me and say, my mother-in-law's, device is bricked, and they're saying they want an explant, but she's 85. And the discussion is, well, how do you explain to an 85-year-old that they now need to have surgery to remove a device, which is super risky because the update bricked it? So sometimes when we react to cyber flaws without fully investigating it, we might make the problem worse. Does that mean we shouldn't build secure devices? Of course we should build secure devices. That's the whole purpose of this. This is why the FDA's got guidance. This is why we've moved towards a place where security is embedded. The difficulty comes in 5 years down the line, 6 years down the line when the device is in someone. What do we do then? And ultimately, it's the patient's decision on how badly they feel the risk is to themselves. And it's only them that can make that decision, right? It's easy recalling things that aren't attached to patients or even in patients. Like I said to someone, if I get a phone call and I'm like saying for a low probability of something being exploited, I need to take out my device. I'm probably going to tell you to go have a nice day. I'm not interested. because surgery has a real life risk: infection, rejection, pocket compromise. Those are things I know can happen. I've experienced them happening. Hacking my implant, the chances of that is very low.
Wow. I think what your story is teaching me is that in the end, cybersecurity risk is just one amongst many risks that patients have to think about. And yes, cybersecurity needs to be taken care of, visibility needs to be fixed, but there's so many more considerations that I don't necessarily think about when you don't go through this personally. So thanks a lot for sharing this story. If you had one final question, if you had one thing you could change about the medical device industry, specifically around cybersecurity, what do you think would be the priority for you to change?
I think the priority for me would be the patient perspective. I think the patient perspective is often forgotten, right? The physician's perspective is when a physician says something, it matters because they're the client, right? And this is for everything. But we should never forget, as cybersecurity professionals, there is a patient on that line that is dependent on that device functioning. So let's say we build cybersecurity in. We built the perfect device that's now secure, and it might not be operable medically because we can't have easy access. It's too complicated, because security has done this often where we build these complex systems and they don't function, right? Who pays the price? Not the manufacturer, not the physician, patients. So don't forget that there's a patient on the other side. So when you are making recommendations and statements, remember that there is someone that might be listening. There might be a mother that's child is attached to an infusion pump, right? That's perfectly functional. There's nothing wrong with it. But your fear-mongering will have an impact. I've realized so much that I have to count my words, especially in the public domain, as to not cause someone to decide not to have an ICD or a pacemaker or an insulin pump, because I'm talking about cybersecurity that's not as scary to me, but as scary to them, right? We need to be aware that there's a patient, and that patient is of flesh and blood and emotion and anxiety, right? We have a responsibility to educate them in a safe manner that is psychologically safe, right? But we often like to fearmonger and talk about worst case scenario. And I think that's what I've changed. I've changed in the 5 years. I used to come in and I used to give everyone grief. Like, as a patient, I was upset. I was angry for a good 3 years. And then I started to actually work with the developers and the engineers that manufactured these things. Their intent is not to be insecure. They are doing the best with what they can whilst maintaining usability for patients. So I think as cybersecurity professionals, we need to give a little bit of grace to understand that these devices keep people alive. They're not just there to be secure.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for coming on, V.
It's a pleasure, and if anyone has any questions, they can just Google me. They'll find me. They'll find all my angry soapboxes. At the moment, my soapbox is all about the patient. And if there's anyone that has got a kid that's getting an implant, I give out books. I've written a children's book about that, specifically about getting devices and explaining technology to kids in terms of medical devices. Ironically, I did that whilst having my surgery because I was bored. So reach out. I'm always happy to chat. And thank you so much for having me.
Thanks again, V. It's wonderful to have you. Hey, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this first episode of the Medical Device Cybersecurity Podcast. If you'd like to see more of it, be sure to click the subscribe button and activate the bell. I'll see you on the next one.